Welcome to Life as God Intended. I'm Don Brzezinski. Thanks for joining us today. Please subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up if you like the video. What would you think if I told you your personality reveals who you are not rather than who you really are? Intrigued? Then take a listen. Thank God your identity doesn't focus on you. You are not the source of who you are. Say, well, then who am I? And this is despite what I'm going to classify as the humanistic, psychological, sociological promotion of yourself being the center of the universe. That's kind of like how everybody's been living. That, it's all about me. I love one author's reflection of this. He says, we're the Lord of the Ring. So if you draw a circle and you're the center of your own circle, your own dominion, your own domain, and we try to chart our own course, do our own thing. That's humanism. And so psychology and sociology has promoted a false narrative about identity that primarily focuses on you. But notice, to the exclusion of God, who is the designer of you. As if God didn't have anything to do with your identity and your design. And so we can see that developing a healthy identity is not, as has been promoted, about loving yourself or accepting yourself or even thinking well of yourself. Oh, please spare me. No, not at all. It's not at all simply about you. You see, the truth is, the deepest part of your identity is at the realm of the Spirit. You have a spiritual source. You have a spiritual identity. Your humanity or your person has a spirit core which identifies you. And it's not based on what you do, what you have, or who you know. The three criteria that we've all thought that we could enhance, and then therefore we could enhance our identity. No, it's rather, that is, your identity or who you are is rather determined by who you're identified with. Or I like to say it this way, joined to spiritually. There you see, we've got a spiritual union. You see, it's a spiritual union that's going to really determine your identity. And as you begin to understand that, then you can begin to be who God's designed you to be. So your identity has to do with who you are spiritually, not the development of your personality. Those are two completely different dynamics. What has been referred to, your personality, what you might refer to as your self-identity. I would rather prefer to use the word your individuality. Your individuality is your personality, and that's fine. But identity has to do with who you are at your spiritual core. It has to do with the human spirit. You see, as a human being, you and I consist of a human spirit, a soul, and a body. We have three levels of life capacity. And so when we're talking about identity, we're talking about spiritual union. And it's our spiritual union that determines our identity. Now, to make this kind of simple, to really help you to see a contrast, I'll say it like this. Birth, not behavior. Birth determines identity. Boy, our society's got that completely backwards. It's got it upside down. Our society is taught that if you can just learn how to behave differently, then you could become the person you've always wanted to be. I would say, no, you can't. If you discover who you really are, you can learn to participate with your spiritual identity, and then you can learn to allow for your behavior to reflect your identity. So I want you to notice it's a who and not a what that determines your identity or who you are. And that's so important. You see, when you and I were born into this world, what we might refer to as our initial or our first birth, what the Bible refers to as your natural birth, you were born into a family identity. I'm a Brzezinski. I was born into the Brzezinski family. That was my identity by inheritance. But I also was born into a spiritual family. You see, that's what we're talking about here today. So I had a spiritual source that related to who I was. I was, and you were, descendants not only of your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather, but all the way back to Adam. What the Bible refers to as being in Adam. That was the identity that we inherited. Or was it? Notice that the Apostle Paul reminds us in Ephesians that we were all children of, are you ready? Wrath. Ooh, sounds kind of bad, wrath. And we were connected to Satan. You can read about it there in Ephesians chapter 2 in the first 3 verses. That we were a sinner by birth and condemned. And as a result, we had no rescue. We were lost, and we were destined to a spiritual destiny of hell and everlasting separation from God. You see, that was our first birth identity. But the good news of the gospel, if you keep reading there in Ephesians chapter 2, beginning at verse 4, is but God. But God made a way out. You see, I said there was nothing you and I could do to change our identity. But thank God there's something that God did. And it's called the gospel. But so many have really not understood the gospel. You see, you and I were crucified with Christ. We were taken out of Adam, and we were born anew into Christ's life. And this is the miracle of the second birth, or what's been referred to as the new birth. No wonder Jesus, he talks about this in John's Gospel, chapter 3, if you want to look it up. He says, "Marvel not that I say unto you that you must be born again or born from above." Well, that had Nicodemus shaking his head. He was an old man and he couldn't understand spiritual things. Well, that was pretty obvious. None of us do. And so he was like, "Oh, how do I get back into my mother's womb? I know I had an initial birth. He's talking about me needing to be born again. I don't get it." And Jesus said, "No, I'm talking about a spiritual birth. By God's doing in Christ, your second birth, you experienced," and this is such a key understanding, you experienced a spiritual exchange. And the Bible describes this in so many different ways. But you went from spiritually being dead, children of wrath, to becoming spiritually alive with the resurrection life of Jesus Christ. And that's what Paul wrote to the Colossians about. Because, you see, this identity problem has been around for centuries. Nothing new, as Solomon wrote. People struggle with the same things over and over from generation to generation. And so Paul wrote to the Colossians attempting to help them understand the same thing I'm trying to attempt us to understand, our true identity in Christ. And what he wrote about is, he said that for he, that is Jesus, delivered us from the dominion of darkness and transferred us to the dominion or to the kingdom of his beloved Son. Now, I don't want to take the time, but there's a powerful verse in Acts chapter 26 and verse 18 that talks about this, and he uses that word dominion. It's the Greek word exousios. And I'm not trying to become overly analytical with Greek, but I just want you to understand because we don't get this in English. That Greek word literally means ek, which is ek, ousia, is the second part of the word. Ek means out of, and ous means being. So what is he saying? He's saying that we have been taken out of the being of Satan's dominion, and that we have been placed into the being of God, or we are now functioning out of the being of God. Now that's very, very important, because what it begins to help us to understand, when it comes to identity, we function by deriving out of the spiritual essence or the spiritual being that we are joined to in our human spirit. So kind of a little bit of a recap. In our first birth, we were deriving out of the being of Satan. And in the new birth, we began deriving out of the being of God. And so you can see what I just said. There's a spiritual exchange that's taken place. And here's the important part. The ramifications of that will change your life, or the lack thereof. You see, the fact that we haven't understood who we are, we haven't understood our identity, that's the reason we're not behaving the way that we want to behave. Because to behave the way that God's intended us to behave requires that we participate with the God that we've become joined to. And so spiritual exchange determines your new identity in Christ. And it's what makes us who we are, and it makes it possible for you and I to experience the saving life of Christ on a day-to-day basis, relationally going forward from this point forward. Now, let me ask you, what did you do to make that occur? Nothing. Then how did it occur? It was something that God did for you and I. And all that you and I could do is to receive it by faith. So I hope you begin to enjoy living in the reality of who God has made you to be. We hope you were encouraged and blessed by this video. We would love to have your feedback and interact with you. If you have a testimony that relates to today's discussion, please share it below in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so that each time we upload a video that you'll be notified. Be sure to check out our blog on our website, which is in the description below. And until next time, may you experience life as God intended.